1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 through 16. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? But that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. This is the beginning of a new section in 1 Corinthians, where from chapters 11 through 14, Paul will address different issues of worship. And he begins by praising the Corinthians. This first section right here is about praise. He praises the Corinthians for, here we go, remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I passed them on to you. Remembering me and holding to the traditions. And, let me do that. Remembering me in everything. Given the letter, it's strange that he would say in everything. But I think that it does a good idea. It's a good way of us seeing the general truth. This is generally true of the Corinthians. They, for the most part, listen to what Paul has to say, and so he praises them. Secondly, he praises them for holding the traditions. And he's about to get into one of those traditions, one of those common practices that the church has. And so he begins in this next section. But I want you to realize, let me go to this. So that first one is praise. And here he goes. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And so this next section here, so the first one was about praise. This next section here is about headship. And he says three things. The head of every man is Christ. That's one. The head of woman is man. That's two. And the head of Christ is God. That's three. That word head is repeated 3 times in there. Head, head, head. This is important because it is a concept as opposed to a single word. Oftentimes you'll see people try to define head here as authority, head here as source. I think it's important for us to realize that if the word head is to be used here of man in his relationship to Christ, woman in her relationship to man, and Christ in his relationship to God, that it goes deeper than just authority, and it goes deeper than just source. It is both of those things. It's also preeminence, and I think above all, leadership. That the one who leads Christ, directs him, is God, and God the Father at that, and Christ is submitted to the leadership of God the Father. That God has placed man as the head of woman, and that God is the head of Christ, and that Christ is the head of every man. Obviously, he doesn't go in order here on the hierarchy of God down on. He goes at different portions and different ways to talk about this, but we see the general structure here that God is the head of Christ. Christ is the head of man, and man is the head of woman. And what's important to understand here is that these two relationships parallel one another. There is a parallel relationship here that isn't here, not parallel. The gap between us and God is infinitely large. But the gap between God and Christ and the gap between man and woman, those actually parallel one another in many ways, meaning that we can understand headship by looking at how God is the head of Christ to understand how man is supposed to be the head of woman. So here he goes. First he praises them. Secondly, he gives them this word on headship. And then he goes into some examples here that count towards this issue of headship. And how does this get played out? And remind you that this is connected to this concept of tradition, right? This third piece here. And so this is really introducing headship. And so he begins. Every man who prays or prophesies. So this is condition 1. With his head covered, condition 2. It's condition 1. Dishonors his head. This is the end result. I'm going to highlight head as we go through this, all right? His head covered, dishonors his head. And immediately upon doing this, what you should see is the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. Immediately we are faced with a question here. Does he mean the same thing every time he uses the word head? And I think the clear answer is no. It can't be, right? If you pray with your head covered, you dishonor your head. Head here, pray with my head covered. Well, that can't be a reference to Christ. I can't cover Christ. Dishonors his head. And then it's not the head that's dishonored in covering it. It's Christ who's dishonored, right? So what I'm going to do here is just to help us understand what's going on, I'm going to keep blue as the color for headship that is spiritual, and I'm going to go red for every time headship is literal physical head, right? So a man who prays or prophesies, condition 1, with his head covered, condition 2, physical head, he dishonors his head. And head here clearly is a reference to Christ. Christ is dishonored when a man prays or prophesied with his head covered. But, okay? This next statement is going to stand in some sort of opposition to the first one. Every woman who prays or prophesies, bingo, that's condition number 1 for this second statement. Prophesies with, here's condition 2, her head uncovered. Oops, I did it again. Condition 2. And here is the resulting scenario. Dishonors her head. And so now we understand why that word but was used. If a man prays with his head covered, he dishonors his head. But it's different for a woman. Head uncovered for the woman dishonors her head. Now they're both capable of dishonoring their heads, but in different ways. So again, let's differentiate with her physical head covered, dishonors her, again, spiritual head. It's paralleling the statement that it was already made about man, and her spiritual head is man. It would be important for us to understand in the Greek that the Greek word for man can be used interchangeably for husband, and the Greek word for woman can be used interchangeably for wife. And so her head, man, I don't think is a reference to every man, but rather that every woman does indeed have a head, a spiritual head. And it would either be her husband, or I think another way that we could understand this text is the father, right? And so that's what we're seeing here in this text. And obviously fathers are supposed to be the spiritual head for their for their family. So they're in that place of preeminence, they're in that place of leadership. There's also some authority there. There's also some source there. But ultimately, it's about, I think, leadership. I think it's the biggest piece in all of this. And then he gives us a parallel situation for us to understand this question. We could ask the question here: how much dishonor? To what degree is her spiritual head dishonored by not having her head covered? Well, he gives us an example here. It is the same. That's an equal sign. It is the same as having her head shaved, right? Which obviously we need to go into this and say, like, what does that mean? Because when women have shaved heads here, it's not necessarily a shameful thing. But in Greek society, if your wife cheated on you, you could send her away and you could shave her head. Father had a daughter who was maybe sleeping with somebody. He could shave her head and send her away. So it was actually kind of the greatest form of shame, one of the greatest forms of shame in their society for women. So it is the same as having her head having her head shaved. And in that way, he's made a parallel here between an uncovered head during prayer. It's the same thing. It's just as shameful as having her head shaved. That's an alarming statement for the Corinthians. 4. And so now he's going to ground that statement. If a woman does not cover her head, so this is this. If you do this, she might as well. This, right? Might as well. That's an equal sign. She might as well have cut her hair off, right? She might as well have cut her hair off. So uncovered head during prayer, might as well have your hair cut off, right? It mirrors what was just said over here. And now he's going to take that piece of logic and reverse it. If it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off, and no one would disagree with this at this point, no one would say that's fine, it's no big deal. No, they all agree having your hair cut off is shameful. So if it's shameful to have your hair cut off or your head shaved, if that's shameful, then, right, here's the great old if-then statement, right? If, then she should cover her head. If it's disgraceful to have your hair cut off, and having your hair cut off is the same as being uncovered, then she should cover her head. So you can kind of see he just kind of reverses his line of reasoning from 4 to 6. And he's just making the point about here as we get into, I said headship. I should have wrote head coverings. Introduce head coverings. And he makes his position kind of very clear right at the outset that women should wear head coverings. Should wear head coverings, right? As an act of honor towards one's head, spiritual head. That's the goal here, right? Because he grounds it here first in headship in verse 3. Okay, let's keep going. Paul has already addressed men once, right? Every man who prays or prophesies with his head uncovered dishonors his head. He brings up men a second time right here. A man ought to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created from woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that the woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. So what I like to do is close off that section right here, and we're going to kind of break this into 3 pieces. Sorry. There we go. We're going to break this into 3 pieces. A man ought not cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. 4, man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. There we go. And it is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. Okay, so that's our section. Let's work through this. A man ought not to cover his head, so we've got a bit of a command here. Don't cover your head, men. We ask ourselves the question, why? And the answer comes out right here, since he is the image and glory of God. So what Paul is saying is, because man is the image and glory of God, men should not cover their heads. All right? That is a kind of point of logic that I think is lost on present day audiences because we're so culturally removed from this setting. But for Paul, for the church of this time, I'm sure the logic of that statement was pretty obvious. For them, it made sense. They're culturally, we're close enough to head coverings that the idea of a man covering his head as the image bearer of God seems strange. But, right? So that's the example of men, and now here's the example of woman. But woman is the glory of man, right? And so what Paul is doing here is he's appealing to creation, right? That's what this whole section right here is an appeal to creation. But woman is the glory of man. So man is the glory of God. Woman is the glory of man. And I think for us, we would probably want to say, like, in what way, right? In what way is man glorifying God? By being made in his image. He bears God's likeness, and so he's kind of the representation of the glory of God. Since woman, and particularly here Eve, was created from Adam, woman in this way kind of parallels here. She is the glory of man in the same way that man is the glory of God. She's in a sense, made in the image of Adam. Now, it's really important that we don't overstate that, because we don't want to make it sound like humanity as a whole isn't made in the image of God. It's both men and women who are made in the image of God. But Paul is zooming in on the moment of creation. And what we discover in the moment of creation is that God has put in place differences in the genders, men and women. And some of these differences relate to their role and relation to one another in the same way that the God the Father and God the Son have differences in role and relation. So here we go. For man did not come from woman, right? We know that because Eve was made from man, but woman from man. Neither, so that's one. Here's the second one. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. And so because woman came from man and woman was made for man, and that's in the garden, God gives Adam a job and he needs help. And so God makes woman to help Adam and they fill the earth, right? So we have that example of creation. And he's saying it is for this reason, right? And this reason is that woman was made from man and that woman was made for man, that a woman ought to have authority over her own head. What? Oh man, I forgot to keep my heads highlighted. Let me get back. For if a woman does not cover her head, that's a physical head, she might as well have her hair cut off. It's a disgrace for a woman to have her head physical shaved. Then she should cover her head. Again, physical here. A man ought not cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is going to man. Neither was man created for woman. For this reason, it is for this reason that woman to have authority over her own. Which one? Is it red or is it blue? It's red. Her own head. The authority here, it wouldn't make sense for it to be about man. So it wouldn't make sense for this reason a woman ought to have authority over her own man, because that doesn't connect with what Paul's just said. So he must be talking about her physical head. But the question then becomes, how does putting a head covering give a woman authority over her own head? That's the question. And that has a cultural answer. For women, exposed hair, exposed braids were shameful. Not maybe shameful. You would only do it if you wanted men to oogle your braids, to look at you, for the most part. Women wore head coverings. Respectful women wear head coverings. Women from high society wore head coverings. But if you were trying to get other men to look at you, you would expose your braids. There are places in the world today where, in America, we hide our privates, right? We hide our chest, we hide our groin area. But for women in this society, it was the hair. You don't expose those parts of yourself. If you do, it's kind of like the rest of the world having some naked photo of you. And so a woman ought to have authority over her own head. He's saying that if you take off your head coverings and other men can just look at your hair, that you've lost authority over your own image. You kind of lost authority of your own shame, and you're allowing other people to just kind of oogle your, in a sense, your nakedness. And so what does this have to do with the angels, right? And let me just say that I don't know. But if I had to guess, it would be that the angels in some way are attending to the worship of the church. And that we should do things that are pleasing to God in worship and not displeasing. And that's the only thing that I can come up with. Otherwise, I've got no explanation for that sentence. Sorry, everyone. Nevertheless, here we go. Here's the next section. In the Lord, woman is not dependent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For woman came from man, but also man is born from woman. But everything comes from God. And so he appeals to creation, and then he balances the roles. One could take just what he's saying here, woman born from man and woman made for man, and kind of create two classes of humans. Men who are free and women who are just slaves, bound up for men. But he reminds the audience, the Corinthians, that that's not the case. In fact, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, which means that this reality has its source in God, nor is man independent of woman. Well, how can you say that, Paul? Here's how we don't have independence from one another. Woman comes from man. Man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. So Eve came from man. But every man after that has been born of a woman. So God has intentionally balanced humanity so that we don't have a situation of two classes of people, the men and the lower women. There is a mutual dependence, a mutual love. There is this other piece, everything comes from God in the Lord. There is this reality that man and woman together are made in the image of God, together are in the Lord, together come from God. And so as he balances the roles, he also reorients the relationship to God. To God. It's not all about women worshiping man. That's another danger of overstating this. Women ultimately should have their lives oriented to God, not to their fathers or to their husbands. So this middle section, there's some debate. Is this about head coverings in this second piece, or is this about headship? And we do have a mention here about having authority over your own head. We do have a mention up here about covering your own head. But that's the question. Is this middle verses 7 through 12, is this about headship or about head coverings? And it probably isn't wise to overly separate those things, but I think that the primary focus of that text is on headship. And he appeals to the created order to talk about headship, but he also balances that out in the reality that man is now born from woman. Okay, we're now into the last piece. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? And so we're all faced with that decision to judge for ourselves. Now, clearly, Paul intends, let me change this. Judge, right? Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered, right? And we look at the outline just made, that it would be both, it would be dishonoring, right? Dishonoring to one's head. dishonoring to expose hair in worship to others. We could see that being a shameful act towards the husband. But Paul, again, orients this to God. Is it okay for her to pray to God this way? And so we're seeing that if she doesn't honor her head, her spiritual head, her husband, that she's also not going to be able to honor God. And that these two things should be working in tandem together. And so you can't shame your husband by flaunting your hair during a worship service and still be honoring to the Lord. The angels, it would appear, are perturbed by that. So he thinks at this point that this answer is obvious. Answer is obvious. And then he goes into this next section, right? And this is a different kind of argument here. This is an argument from nature. Argument from nature. And so he uses a word here. Does not the very nature of things, let me go back here, head uncovered. Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? But that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for hair is given to her as a covering. So Paul appeals up to nature here, the very nature of things. And his argument from nature is as follows. If a man has long hair, then, if-then statements, right? It is a disgrace to him. And if we say, why would you say that, Paul? Why would you say that it's disgraceful? He would say that the very nature of things teaches you this. Secondly, but that if a woman has long hair, there we go, there's our second if-then statement, then it is her glory. Okay, again, we would say, well, why is long hair her glory? Boom, he would say, the very nature of things. And he would add a second reason to this, or a second piece to this. And he would say, for long hair is given to her as a covering. So what he's saying is that, men don't have long hair by nature. Men have short hair by nature. And that short hair is not equal to a built-in covering, if you will. But that women have been given long hair by nature, and long hair shows that God does want them, in fact, to cover their head. Because if they were to shave their hair, it would be just as shameful as not wearing a covering, right? That's his point here. So he says, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. So long hair for the woman, glory, good thing. Long hair for the man, disgrace. And so we're left with a question here about this word, nature. Is this part of created order? Created order? Or are these kind of cultural absolutes? In their society, men who wore their hair long were typically effeminate. It would be kind of like cross-dressing today. And women who had their hair short had been massively disgraced. And there weren't a bunch of exceptions to that like there are today for us. And so when Paul says nature, is he appealing to kind of the cultural absolutes of his time? Or is he saying that really God intended men to have short hair and God intended women to have long hair, and that to go contrary to that is to dishonor yourself or to take away your own glory, right? And he grounds that statement in a strange final question, right? Verse 16, all the way to the end. And that's the argument from nature. And then final grounding in common church practice. Is this last section. It says, if anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. His point here is that only the most contentious people would disagree with what's been said so far. He reminds them all, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. In every church, in the early church, every single one, women had their hair covered to pray. And so only the most contentious person, only the most disagreeable, rebellious person would try to have some other practice. the act of taking off your head covering is so disgraceful to your husband, so disgraceful to God, that there is no reason to take it off. The question that we have to ask ourselves today is, are these truths universal or cultural, right? And this is something that you're going to have to answer on your own. What's universally true, beyond doubt, is headship. It's part of the created order. The question is the cultural expression of head coverings also part of the created order, or is that cultural? We can't really question headship. That's built in. But head coverings, we have to wonder. He does appeal to nature here. He appeals to, all the way up here, he appeals to shame. It's a disgrace. Shame can be cultural at times. Other times it's permanent, right? So we have that question in our minds, and that you could kind of connect that all the way down if you wanted to, all the way down. Shoop, shoop. That might lean you to the cultural pot, but again, these things could very easily be on the universal side. These things could very much be on the nature side. And so it's really important that as we interpret this text, that we rightly understand it, because it's too easy for us to go through and say, hey, that's a cultural expression, we don't have to wear head coverings today. And it's too easy to go and say, hey, that's a universal truth and we had better wear head coverings today. And it's tough. I don't know. There's two ways to take it, and if you go through this and you're thinking, man, I think these truths are universal, then hey, you should. These truths are universal. Then you should absolutely, ladies, put on a head covering and honor God and honor your husbands that way. But if you think that that's the cultural expression of that and that you're not bound by that today, you have to have a really good reason for that. And not only that doesn't mean that we're absolved of headship. In fact, then we have to wonder, what are the ways that we can bring honor or shame to our heads? And for men, that's Christ, and for women, that's men. Let us not also forget that man is not independent of woman, woman's not independent of man. And so not only do we bring honor to our head, we also bring honor to the one that we're over. Just as God the Father brings honor to Jesus, so too husbands should bring honor to their wives. And that's all I have to say about this text. It's a very challenging text, to say the least, to make sure that we understand right. And it's also very challenging because culturally we're really far away from it. And so this can be a pretty scary text for us. I would encourage you not to let your present day culture make the decision for you. Let the Spirit guide you to His truth and live, judge for yourself, which isn't how Paul intends to use that. But I will say, judge for yourself and make the choice that honors God most.